Have you ever stood in a courtroom and watched the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally try to convince everyone that you were the problem? That you were lying, manipulating, seeking attention? I have. And let me tell you, there's nothing quite like the soul-crushing weight of sitting just feet away from your own parents as they paint you as a monster while playing the victims themselves. But what happened next, what the judge asked them in that silent, tense courtroom, changed everything. It exposed them in ways I never could have imagined. This is my story, and I'm sharing it because I know somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that they're not alone, that the truth does matter, and that sometimes justice actually prevails even when it feels impossible. I remember every single detail of that day. The courtroom smelled like old wood and anxiety. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting this cold, sterile glow over everything. I sat at the table with my attorney, my hands trembling so badly I had to clasp them together in my lap just to keep them still. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out almost everything else. Across the aisle, my parents sat with their lawyer, dressed impeccably as always. My mother wore a navy blue dress with pearls, looking every bit the respectable, concerned parent. My father had on his best suit, the one he wore to church every Sunday, the one that made him look like a pillar of the community. They looked perfect. They always looked perfect. That was the problem. No one ever suspected what happened behind our front door because they were so good at pretending, so skilled at wearing masks that never slipped in public. The gallery was packed. Social workers, court-appointed advocates, a few reporters who had caught wind of the case, and even some people from our old neighborhood who probably came out of morbid curiosity more than anything else. I felt their eyes on me, judging, wondering, trying to figure out if I was telling the truth or if I was just some troubled teenager causing problems for no reason. That's what my parents' lawyer had been trying to establish from the beginning, that I was unstable, rebellious, a liar who fabricated stories for attention. I'd heard those words so many times by then that sometimes, in my darkest moments, I almost started to believe them myself. Almost. But I knew the truth. I lived it every single day for 16 years before I finally found the courage to speak up. The bruises that were carefully hidden under long sleeves and high collars. The psychological warfare that left no visible marks but carved deep wounds into my sense of self. The isolation, the manipulation, the constant fear that permeated every moment of my existence in that house. I knew what really happened, and now I just had to make everyone else believe me too. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing, like I was carrying the entire world on my shoulders, and one wrong word, one moment of doubt, could make it all come crashing down. My attorney, Ms. Rodriguez, was incredible. She believed me from the very first meeting when I could barely get the words out through my tears. She'd handled cases like mine before, she told me, and she recognized the signs immediately. The way I flinched at sudden movements, the way I chose my words so carefully, always second-guessing myself, the way I apologized for things that weren't my fault. These were patterns she'd seen in countless abuse victims, and she knew how to help me tell my story in a way that people would finally hear. But even with her support, even with all the evidence we'd gathered, I was terrified, because I knew how convincing my parents could be. I'd watched them charm teachers, neighbors, relatives, church members, anyone and everyone for my entire life. They were masters of deception, and I was just a scared kid trying to fight back against people who had spent years breaking me down. The preliminary hearings had been brutal. My parents' attorney, a silver-haired man named Mr. Hutchinson who looked like someone's kindly grandfather, had torn into my credibility with surgical precision. He brought up every time I'd ever gotten in trouble at school, every argument I'd had with my parents, every less-than-perfect grade or moment of teenage rebellion, and tried to paint a picture of a troubled, dishonest child who couldn't be trusted. He asked me invasive questions about my mental health, my relationships, my social media posts, anything he could twist to make me look unstable or vindictive. I'd cried on the stand more than once, which he then used against me, suggesting I was being manipulative and performative. It felt like being violated all over again, except this time it was happening in front of dozens of strangers who were all watching and judging. But Ms. Rodriguez was strategic. She carefully built her case piece by piece, knowing that we needed more than just my word against theirs. She brought in medical records showing injuries that my parents had explained away as accidents. She found my old teachers and counselors who testified that they'd noticed changes in my behavior, signs of distress that they hadn't fully understood at the time. She presented journal entries I'd written, desperate pleas for help that I'd been too afraid to show anyone while I was still living under my parents' roof. She brought in expert witnesses who explained the psychology of abuse, how victims often don't report immediately, how they make excuses for their abusers, how they blame themselves. She was building a case that was about more than just my testimony. She was creating a comprehensive picture that was harder to dismiss. Still, I could see the doubt in some people's faces. My parents had cultivated such a positive reputation in our community. My father was a deacon at our church. My mother volunteered at the local food bank. They attended every PTA meeting, hosted neighborhood barbecues, always smiled and waved when they passed people on the street. How could such upstanding citizens possibly be the monsters I was describing? That cognitive dissonance was written all over the faces of some of the people in that courtroom, and it made my stomach turn. Because that's exactly what my parents counted on. They knew that if they maintained their perfect facade, people would be less likely to believe that anything dark lurked beneath the surface. And for 16 years, their strategy had worked perfectly. I'll never forget the feeling of sitting in that courtroom, waiting for the trial to begin, knowing that this was it. This was my one chance to be heard, to be believed, to finally escape the nightmare that had been my entire childhood. If I failed, if the judge didn't see through their lies, I didn't know what would happen to me. Would I be sent back to them? Would I be labeled a liar and have that follow me for the rest of my life? Would anyone ever believe me again? The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the pressure was almost unbearable. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in, like I might just shatter into a million pieces right there in front of everyone. Ms. Rodriguez must have sensed my panic because she reached over and gently touched my hand. "You've got this," she whispered. "Just tell the truth. That's all you have to do. Tell your truth and I'll handle the rest." I nodded, trying to draw strength from her confidence even though I felt anything but strong. I glanced over at my parents again, and my mother was staring at me with this look I knew so well. It was the look that said I was making a terrible mistake, that I would pay for this, that I was betraying the family, and there would be consequences. Even across the courtroom, even surrounded by all these people and the protection of the law, that look still made my blood run cold. That's how deeply their control had been embedded in me. Even when I was fighting back, part of me was still terrified of them. The judge entered, and we all stood. Judge Patricia Morrison was known for being fair, but tough. She'd been on the bench for over 20 years and had a reputation for seeing through nonsense. I prayed she would see through my parents' act. She would have to, wouldn't she? Surely someone with her experience could recognize the truth when it was staring her right in the face. But I'd been disappointed so many times before, by people who should have helped but didn't, by people who saw the warning signs but looked the other way, by people who believed my parents' charming lies instead of my desperate truth. Why would this time be any different? I tried to push those thoughts away and focus on what Ms. Rodriguez had told me. Tell the truth, just tell the truth and trust that it would be enough. The proceedings began, and it was like being pulled into a whirlwind. Opening statements, witness testimonies, cross-examinations, objections, legal jargon I didn't fully understand. I sat there trying to follow along, trying to stay present, but part of me kept dissociating, a defense mechanism I'd developed years ago when things got too intense at home. I'd mentally check out, go somewhere else in my mind where I was safe and nothing could hurt me, but I couldn't afford to do that now. I needed to be here, fully present, ready to tell my story when the time came. So I dug my fingernails into my palms, used the physical pain to anchor myself to the moment, and forced myself to stay focused. When it was finally my turn to testify, I thought I might throw up. Walking to the witness stand felt like walking to my own execution. Every step was heavy, reluctant, terrifying. I was sworn in, my voice barely above a whisper as I promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, as if I would do anything else. The truth was all I had. It was the only weapon I'd ever had against them, and I was finally being given the chance to use it. Ms. Rodriguez started with easy questions, establishing the basics, helping me find my voice and settle into the rhythm of testimony. Where did I live? Who were my parents? How long had the abuse been going on? Basic facts that I could handle without falling apart. But I knew the hard questions were coming, and I braced myself for them. "Can you describe for the court what life was like in your home?" Ms. Rodriguez asked gently. And that's when I really had to dig deep and find the courage to say out loud, in front of all these strangers, the things I'd kept hidden for so long. I took a shaky breath and began. I told them about the first time I remember being hit, how I was maybe 5 or 6 years old and had spilled juice on the carpet, how my father's hand came out of nowhere and knocked me to the ground, how my mother stood there and watched, not intervening, not protecting me, just watching with this cold, detached expression. I told them how that became a pattern, how any small mistake or perceived disobedience was met with violence, Sometimes it was my father, sometimes my mother, sometimes both of them tag teaming to break me down physically and emotionally. I described the psychological abuse too, which in many ways was even worse than the physical violence. The constant criticism, the way nothing I did was ever good enough, the name-calling, being told I was stupid, worthless, a burden, a mistake. The gaslighting, being told that things I knew had happened didn't actually happen, that I was remembering wrong, that I was crazy. The isolation, how they limited my contact with friends and extended family, how they monitored my phone and computer, how they made sure I was always under their control with no one to turn to for help. I explained how they would switch seamlessly between being cruel behind closed doors and playing the perfect parents in public, and how that made me feel like I was losing my mind because the contrast was so extreme. As I spoke, I watched my parents. My mother's face was a mask of composed sadness, like she was the victim of a heartbreaking misunderstanding. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue occasionally, playing the role of the devastated mother being falsely accused by her troubled daughter. My father looked stern and disappointed, shaking his head slightly at my testimony as if he couldn't believe I would say such terrible lies about them. They were performing, just like they always did, and I could see some people in the courtroom buying it. That made me want to scream, to somehow make them understand that this was exactly what my parents did. This was how they operated. Please don't fall for it like everyone else had. But all I could do was keep telling my story and hope it would be enough. Mr. Hutchinson's cross-examination was every bit as brutal as I'd expected. He poked holes in my timeline, pointed out inconsistencies in details that I'd gotten wrong because trauma doesn't create perfect memories. He brought up every time I'd lied to my parents about small things, using it to suggest I was lying about everything. He asked why I hadn't reported the abuse sooner, why I hadn't told teachers or counselors or called the police myself. These were questions I'd asked myself 1,000 times, and the answers were complicated. Fear, shame, not knowing who to trust, being told that no one would believe me, being convinced that I somehow deserved it, being so thoroughly broken down that I didn't think I had any other options. But trying to explain that nuance while being aggressively questioned by a hostile attorney in a courtroom full of people was almost impossible. I broke down crying more than once during his cross-examination. He'd ask something particularly painful or accusatory, and I'd lose my composure completely, sobbing so hard I couldn't speak. Each time, I hated myself for it because I knew he was going to use it against me, paint me as unstable and emotional and unreliable. But I couldn't help it. This was my life we were talking about. My trauma, my pain, and having it picked apart and questioned and dismissed was re-traumatizing in ways I hadn't fully prepared for, despite Ms. Rodriguez's warnings. The judge called for breaks several times to let me compose myself, and I appreciated that small mercy, but it didn't make the process any less agonizing. Have you ever had to defend your own abuse to people who didn't want to believe you? Have you ever had to prove that the worst moments of your life actually happened while the people who caused them sat there looking innocent and hurt? If you have, then you know exactly how I felt in that moment. If you haven't, I hope you never have to experience it because it's a special kind of hell that I wouldn't wish on anyone. Comment below if you've ever had to fight to be believed about something important. I'd love to hear your stories and know that I'm not alone in this experience. The trial went on for days. More witnesses, more evidence, more testimony from experts and people who had known our family. My parents took the stand too, of course, and watching them perform was sickening. They cried. They expressed confusion and heartbreak over my accusations. They painted themselves as loving parents who had done their absolute best with a difficult, troubled child. My mother talked about how much she loved me, how she'd sacrificed everything for me, how she couldn't understand where these terrible lies were coming from. My father talked about working hard to provide for our family, about trying to instill good values in me, about being devastated that I would repay their love and dedication with such vicious falsehoods. They were so convincing, so believable, that I could see the sympathy in people's eyes as they listened, and that terrified me. But Ms. Rodriguez was ready for them. She had done her homework, and she systematically dismantled their testimony piece by piece. She brought up inconsistencies in their stories, moments where their accounts didn't match the evidence. She questioned them about specific incidents I'd described, watching them squirm as they tried to explain them away. She presented documentation that contradicted their claims about being loving, attentive parents. Medical records, school reports, statements from people who had witnessed concerning behavior. She didn't let them hide behind their masks, and slowly, cracks started to appear in their perfect facade. One of the most powerful moments came when Ms. Rodriguez called a former neighbor to testify. This woman, Mrs. Chen, had lived next door to us for 3 years before moving away. She testified that she'd heard screaming and crying from our house on multiple occasions. She'd seen me with bruises that my parents explained as sports injuries or clumsiness, but she'd always had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. She admitted, with obvious guilt and tears in her eyes, that she'd thought about calling Child Protective Services but had talked herself out of it because my parents seemed so nice and she didn't want to make trouble over what might be nothing. Her testimony was heartbreaking, but also validating because it showed that the abuse had been real, had been ongoing, and had been witnessed even if no one had intervened at the time. There were other witnesses, too, who provided similar accounts. A former teacher who remembered me coming to school with fingerprint-shaped bruises on my arm and accepting my explanation about roughhousing with friends, but always wondering if there was more to the story. A family friend who had noticed how I seemed anxious and withdrawn around my parents, but had assumed it was just typical teenage moodiness. A pediatrician who had documented injuries over the years that seemed to occur with suspicious frequency, but had never quite crossed the threshold of mandated reporting, because my parents always had plausible explanations, and I never contradicted them. All these people who had seen fragments of the truth, but hadn't put the pieces together until now. It was frustrating that no one had helped me sooner, but it was also validation that I wasn't making this up, that there had been signs all along. The expert witnesses were crucial too. A child psychologist testified about the long-term effects of abuse and how my symptoms and behaviors were entirely consistent with someone who had experienced chronic trauma. A forensic specialist talked about the pattern of injuries documented in my medical records and how they suggested intentional harm rather than accidents. A social worker explained how abusers often present as charming and respectable in public, while being violent and controlling in private, and how this makes it much harder for victims to be believed. Each expert helped to build a framework for understanding my experience that went beyond just my word against my parents' word. As the trial progressed, I started to see subtle shifts in the courtroom. People who had looked skeptical at the beginning were now listening more intently, their expressions more thoughtful. The judge, who had maintained a neutral demeanor throughout, seemed to be paying particularly close attention to certain testimonies and pieces of evidence. My parents, despite their best efforts, were starting to look less confident and more defensive. Mr. Hutchinson's objections were becoming more frequent and more desperate, as if he could sense that their case was slipping away. I wanted to feel hopeful, but I was still too scared to let myself believe that things might actually go my way for once. Then came the moment that changed everything. We were nearing the end of the trial, closing arguments were approaching, and everyone in the courtroom could feel the tension building toward a resolution. The judge had been reviewing some documents, making notes, asking clarifying questions to various witnesses. My parents sat there still trying to maintain their innocent victim act, though it was getting harder for them as the evidence mounted. And then Judge Morrison did something unexpected. She set down her pen, looked directly at my parents, and asked them a question that no one had anticipated. Her voice was calm but firm, cutting through the courtroom noise like a knife. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said, and the room fell completely silent. "I've been listening to testimony for several days now, and I've reviewed all the evidence presented by both sides. I have a question for you, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer." She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over everyone. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. What was she going to ask? If everything your daughter has said is a lie, if she fabricated all of these allegations out of nowhere, then can you explain to me why she would do that? What would possibly motivate a child to make up such elaborate, detailed, consistent stories about abuse if they never happened? What would she gain from putting herself through this ordeal, this public scrutiny, this trauma of testifying against her own parents? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. It was so simple, so direct, yet so devastatingly effective. Because the truth was, there was no good answer to that question. If I was lying, why would I lie? What would be my motivation? I hadn't asked for money, I hadn't tried to get attention or fame, I hadn't attempted to punish them for normal parenting decisions I disagreed with. I had simply reported abuse because abuse had occurred. But my parents, they had never really addressed the fundamental illogic of their defense. They'd focused on attacking my credibility, painting me as troubled and untrustworthy, but they'd never explained why a troubled and untrustworthy person would specifically invent this particular narrative. I watched as my parents exchanged glances, clearly thrown by the question. My father started to speak, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable and authoritative. "Your Honor, teenagers can be very complicated. They sometimes lash out, create drama, seek attention in unhealthy ways. Our daughter has always been a bit difficult, and we think she may be angry about normal discipline and rules that we implemented for her own good. Perhaps she's exaggerating or misinterpreting things that happened, or maybe she's been influenced by outside sources who have put ideas in her head about, "That's not what I asked," Judge Morrison interrupted, her voice sharp. "I didn't ask for speculation about teenage psychology or vague references to her being difficult. I asked for a specific motivation. What does your daughter gain from these allegations? What is her end goal? Is she trying to get money from you? Is she trying to go live with someone else? Is she angry about a specific incident or punishment that she's now retaliating for? Give me something concrete, not generalizations about difficult teenagers." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her composed mask starting to crack. My father's jaw clenched, a tell I recognized from years of living with him. He was angry, frustrated that he was being pushed into a corner, that his usual tactics of deflection and manipulation weren't working. Mr. Hutchinson looked like he wanted to object, but knew he couldn't, because the judge was within her rights to ask for clarification on their defense. And my parents, for maybe the first time in their lives, had no good answer, because there was no logical explanation for why I would put myself through all of this if it wasn't true. My mother finally spoke, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. We don't know why she's doing this. Maybe she's confused, or maybe someone has convinced her that normal parenting is abuse. We love our daughter. We've always loved her. This is breaking our hearts." She started crying, real tears this time, I think, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of sadness or tears of frustration at being cornered. Either way, her non-answer was damning. After days of testimony, after all the evidence and witnesses and expert opinions, they still couldn't provide a plausible reason why I would fabricate everything. Judge Morrison nodded slowly, as if she'd expected exactly that response. "Let me share something with you, and with everyone in this courtroom," she said, her voice taking on a weight that made everyone lean forward to listen. "In my 23 years on the bench, I have presided over countless family court cases. I have seen false allegations, certainly. I have seen bitter divorces where children are weaponized against one parent or another. I have seen teenagers who exaggerate or mischaracterize normal discipline because they're angry about reasonable rules. But I have also seen real abuse, systematic abuse, carefully hidden behind closed doors by people who present themselves as upstanding citizens in public. And I have learned to recognize the patterns." She looked down at her notes, then back up at my parents. "The evidence in this case shows a pattern. Medical records documenting injuries over many years. Testimony from multiple witnesses who noticed concerning signs but didn't intervene. Expert analysis consistent with chronic abuse. A victim whose testimony has remained consistent and detailed despite aggressive cross-examination. And most tellingly, parents who cannot provide a logical explanation for why their daughter would subject herself to this process if her allegations were false. When I weigh all of this evidence, when I apply my years of experience and judgment to this case, I find the testimony of the minor child to be credible and compelling. I couldn't breathe. Was this really happening? Was the judge actually saying she believed me? After all the fear, all the doubt, all the times I'd been told I was lying or crazy or attention-seeking, was someone in authority finally validating my truth? Tears were streaming down my face, but for the first time in this whole ordeal, they were tears of relief rather than pain. Ms. Rodriguez squeezed my hand under the table, and I could see she was emotional too. We'd worked so hard for this moment, and it was finally here. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. She turned her attention back to my parents, and her expression was one of barely contained disgust. What disturbs me most about this case is not just the abuse itself, though that is certainly disturbing enough. What troubles me is the performance I've witnessed in this courtroom, the carefully crafted image of concerned, loving parents that you've presented. The tears, the expressions of hurt and betrayal, the attempts to paint your daughter as troubled and untrustworthy. Because I've seen this before. I've seen abusers who are so skilled at manipulation that they almost convince themselves of their own innocence, who have told lies for so long that they start to believe them, who are more concerned with maintaining their public image than with acknowledging the harm they've caused to their own child. My father started to protest, half rising from his seat. "Your Honor, this is—" But she silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. "You will have your opportunity to speak during sentencing," she said coldly. "Right now, I'm delivering my findings. Sit down." He sat, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The mask was gone now, and what was left was just a man who'd been caught, exposed, and held accountable for the first time in his life. My mother was crying openly, her perfect makeup running down her face, all pretense of composure abandoned. Judge Morrison continued, "I am finding in favor of the petitioner on all counts. The evidence supports findings of physical abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. I am terminating parental rights effective immediately and awarding full custody to the state pending placement in appropriate foster care or with suitable relatives if any can be identified. I am also referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution, as the abuse documented here rises to the level of criminal conduct that warrants charges. This court is adjourned. She struck her gavel, and the sharp crack of wood on wood seemed to echo through my entire body. It was over. I'd won. The truth had won. Justice had actually prevailed. People were moving around me, talking, gathering papers, but I felt frozen in place, unable to fully process what had just happened. Ms. Rodriguez was hugging me, saying something about how proud she was of me, how brave I'd been, how this was the outcome we'd hoped for. Social workers were approaching to talk about next steps, about where I'd be staying, about counseling and support services. Reporters were trying to get comments, their cameras and microphones suddenly everywhere. And across the courtroom, my parents were being escorted out by bailiffs, my mother still crying, my father's face twisted with rage as he shot me one final hateful glare over his shoulder. That glare used to terrify me. It used to make me want to shrink down and disappear, to apologize and beg for forgiveness, even when I'd done nothing wrong. But now, in this moment, with the judge's ruling still ringing in my ears, that glare had no power over me anymore. I'd faced them in court, told my truth, and been believed. I'd won. They couldn't hurt me anymore. The realization of that hit me like a tidal wave, and I started sobbing, huge racking sobs that came from somewhere deep in my soul. All the fear, all the pain, all the years of suffering were pouring out of me, and for the first time, they were mixed with something else. Relief, hope, the possibility of a future that didn't involve constant abuse and terror. The aftermath of the trial was chaotic. The story made local news, then regional news, then even got picked up by some national outlets. Abusive parents exposed after judge's pointed question, read one headline. Teen wins custody battle against parents accused of years of abuse, read another. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know my story, wanted to interview me, wanted to make me the face of child abuse awareness. It was overwhelming and invasive in its own way, but it was also validating. Because now the world knew. Now my parents' perfect facade had been shattered for everyone to see. Now other people who might be suffering in silence might see my story and find the courage to speak up themselves. Ms. Rodriguez helped me navigate the media attention, setting boundaries about what I would and wouldn't discuss publicly. We did a few carefully selected interviews where I talked about the importance of believing children when they report abuse, about the warning signs that people should look for, about the resources available for those who need help. I tried to turn my pain into something purposeful, something that might help others. It was part of my healing process, taking back control of my own narrative and using it to make a difference. The criminal trial came several months later. My parents were charged with multiple counts of child abuse, assault, and endangerment. The trial was shorter than the custody hearing because much of the evidence had already been established. They were both convicted and sentenced to prison time, my father receiving a longer sentence because the physical abuse had primarily come from him. Watching them being led away in handcuffs should have felt triumphant, but mostly it just felt sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that they'd chosen cruelty over love. Sad for the parents I'd wished I could have had instead of the ones I actually got. Living in foster care was an adjustment. I was placed with a kind couple named the Johnsons who specialized in taking in older teenagers from difficult situations. They were patient with me as I struggled with trauma responses, trust issues, and the complex emotions that came with everything I'd been through. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it was like to live in a home without fear, where I could make mistakes without being punished violently, where I was allowed to have privacy, friends, opinions of my own, where people spoke to me with respect and kindness rather than contempt and cruelty. It was strange at first, almost uncomfortable because it was so unfamiliar, but gradually I started to heal. Therapy became a crucial part of my recovery. I worked with a counselor who specialized in trauma from childhood abuse, and slowly, painfully, I began to process everything I'd been through. We talked about the abuse, yes, but also about the guilt I felt for having my parents imprisoned, about the grief over never having had the family I deserved, about the fear that I was somehow damaged or broken beyond repair. My therapist helped me understand that none of what happened was my fault, that children are never responsible for their parents' choice to abuse them, that healing was possible even when it felt impossible. School became easier too. Without the constant stress and fear of going home to an abusive environment, I could actually focus on learning. My grades improved dramatically. I joined clubs and made friends and did all the normal teenage things I'd never been allowed to do before. I even started thinking about college, about a future that extended beyond just surviving each day. It felt revolutionary, this idea that I could have goals and dreams and plans, that my life could be about more than just enduring pain and hiding scars. Have you ever experienced a moment where your whole life changed direction? Where you went from feeling hopeless to seeing possibility? That's what this journey has been for me. If you've been through something similar, or if you're currently in a situation where you need help, please know that speaking up is worth it. It's terrifying, absolutely, but it's worth it. And there are people who will believe you and help you. You're not alone. Share your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. Let's support each other. Looking back now, several years after that pivotal day in court, I can see how far I've come. I'm in college now, studying social work because I want to help other kids who are going through what I went through. I want to be the person who notices the signs, who asks the hard questions, who believes children when they say something is wrong. I want to break the cycles of abuse and help families heal, or when healing isn't possible, help kids escape to safety like I did. My past doesn't define me, but it has shaped me into someone who understands pain and resilience in ways that will make me better at helping others. I still have hard days. Trauma doesn't just disappear because justice was served or time has passed. I have nightmares sometimes, flashbacks to bad moments from my childhood. I struggle with trust and abandonment issues in relationships. I sometimes catch myself falling into old patterns of people-pleasing or minimizing my own needs, because that's what I had to do to survive for so long. But I'm working on it, consistently and consciously. I'm learning to recognize when I'm being triggered and to use healthy coping mechanisms instead of shutting down or self-destructing. I'm learning that I deserve love and respect and kindness, and that it's okay to expect those things from the people in my life. My relationship with the Johnson family evolved into something really special. When I turned 18, they asked if I wanted them to formally adopt me, to make official what already felt true in our hearts. I said yes, and now I have parents who actually deserve that title. We're building new memories, healthy ones, creating the family dynamic I always wished for but never thought I'd have. They came to my high school graduation and cried tears of pride. They helped me move into my college dorm and made sure I knew I always had a home to come back to. They listen when I need to talk and give me space when I need to process things on my own. They're not perfect, because no one is, but they're good and kind and supportive, and that makes all the difference. As for my biological parents, I have no contact with them and don't plan to change that. They wrote me letters from prison a few times, but I chose not to read them. My therapist and I discussed it, and we agreed that I don't owe them forgiveness or reconciliation, that protecting my own peace and mental health is more important than maintaining a relationship with people who hurt me. Maybe someday I'll feel differently, but right now, keeping that boundary is what I need to do for myself, and that's okay. Healing doesn't require forgiveness, despite what some people might say. It requires honesty, self-compassion, and the courage to keep moving forward even when it's hard. The legal system isn't perfect, and I know my case had an unusually positive outcome. Many abuse victims don't get the justice I received. Many aren't believed, or their cases get dismissed, or they're returned to dangerous situations. That's why I try to use my platform and my story to advocate for better protections for children, for more training for mandatory reporters, for legal reforms that make it easier for kids to be heard and believed. I speak at conferences in schools and community events, sharing my experience in the hope that it might inspire change or give courage to someone who needs it. One of the most powerful moments in my healing journey came when I received a message from a girl who had seen one of my interviews. She told me that my story gave her the courage to report her own abusive situation and that she was now safe and getting help. Reading her message, knowing that my pain had been transformed into something that helped someone else escape their own pain, was incredibly meaningful. It reminded me why I chose to speak publicly about my experience despite how uncomfortable and vulnerable it made me feel. If my story can help even one person, then it's worth it. I've learned that healing isn't linear. There are good days and bad days, steps forward and steps back. There are moments when I feel strong and capable and proud of how far I've come, and other moments when I feel broken and scared and wonder if I'll ever be truly okay. But both of those things can be true at the same time. I can be healing and still struggling. I can be moving forward while still carrying scars from the past. Progress isn't about erasing what happened or pretending it didn't affect me. It's about learning to live with it, to integrate it into my story without letting it control my entire narrative. The question the judge asked that day in court, that simple but profound question about motivation, changed my life. It cut through all the noise and manipulation and got to the heart of what really mattered. Why would someone lie about something like this? What would they gain? The answer, of course, was nothing. Nothing except the truth being acknowledged, justice being served, and the chance at a better life. That question validated everything I'd been trying to say, everything I'd been fighting for. It showed that someone in power was actually thinking critically about the situation, instead of just accepting the surface-level performance my parents put on. Sometimes I think about what my life would be like if I hadn't spoken up, if I'd stayed silent out of fear or shame, or the belief that no one would believe me anyway. I'd probably still be trapped in that house, still enduring abuse, still having my spirit crushed a little more each day. Or maybe I would have ended up like some abuse victims who can't take it anymore and make tragic choices to escape their pain. Speaking up saved my life, literally and figuratively. It was the hardest thing I ever did, but it was also the most important. And I want anyone out there who is suffering in silence to know that your voice matters, your truth matters, and you deserve to be safe and loved and respected. If you're watching this and you resonated with my story, I want you to do something for me. First, if you found this story meaningful or if it touched your heart in any way, please leave a like on this video. It helps the algorithm share this story with more people who might need to hear it. Second, subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales for more stories like this one. Real experiences, real struggles, real triumphs from people who have overcome incredible challenges. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload because each story we share has the power to inspire, educate, or help someone who needs it. Third, and most importantly, I want you to understand something. If you're in an abusive situation right now, whether it's from parents, partners, or anyone else, you don't have to suffer in silence. There are resources available. The National Child Abuse Hotline is 1-800-422-4453, and it's available 24/7. If you're not comfortable calling, there are also text and online chat options through organizations like Crisis Text Line and RAIN. Tell a teacher, a counselor, a friend's parent, a coach, anyone you trust. Keep telling until someone listens and helps. Document what's happening if you can safely do so. Save evidence, write down dates and details, take photos if there are visible injuries. I know it's scary, I know it feels impossible, but it's not. You have more strength than you realize, and there are people who will believe you and fight for you. And to everyone watching, whether you've experienced abuse or not, please be aware. Please pay attention to the children and teenagers in your life. Notice changes in behavior, unexplained injuries, signs of fear or anxiety or withdrawal. If something feels off, ask questions. Don't just accept easy explanations, especially if those explanations come from the potential abuser. Be the person who notices, who cares enough to look deeper, who believes children when they say something is wrong. You could literally save a life. My story has a relatively happy ending, but it didn't have to turn out this way. It only did because I found the courage to speak, because I had an attorney who believed me and fought for me, because I encountered a judge who saw through the lies and asked the right questions, because evidence supported my claims, and because the legal system, for once, worked the way it's supposed to. But I know that's not always the case. I know there are countless other victims who aren't as fortunate, who don't get justice, who are still trapped in terrible situations. And my heart breaks for them. That's why I keep telling my story, keep advocating, keep trying to make a difference in whatever way I can. To anyone who has survived abuse, who has fought for their truth and won, or who is still fighting, I see you. I believe you. Your experiences are valid, your pain is real, and you deserve all the healing, support, and happiness in the world. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like what happened to you was your fault, or that speaking up was wrong. You are brave, you are strong, and you are worthy of so much more than the cruelty you endured. Keep going, keep healing, keep building the life you deserve, and know that there's a whole community of survivors out there who understand and who are cheering you on. Thank you so much for watching my story and for taking the time to really listen and understand what I went through. Please drop a comment below sharing your thoughts, your own experiences if you feel comfortable, or just letting me know you were here and that this story mattered to you. Let's create a supportive community where people can share their truths without fear of judgment. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales, and turn on notifications so you can continue following these powerful stories of courage, survival, and hope. Remember, your truth matters, your voice matters, and you are never alone. Stay strong, and I'll see you in the next video.